I'm happy and proud to be standing here years after I first heard the score to celebrate the man who wrote it.
I know how to make movies. I went to film school. I have a knack for it. I studied it very well and practiced, and I know what I'm doing.
Whatever you do, don't do those artsy, abstract movies. I dare you to do a comedy. I said, for God's sakes, I'm 23 years old. I can do a comedy. I can do anything.
Imagine being the man who created one of the most beloved movie franchises in history, then watching the world turn against you. Imagine having billions of dollars, but feeling like you're trapped in a prison of your own making. For decades, George Lucas kept his deepest secrets locked away. But now, at 81 years old, the creator of Star Wars is finally telling the whole truth about what really happened behind the scenes. What he's revealing will shock you. The car crash that nearly killed him and changed cinema forever. The secret he kept from his own actors that created the biggest plot twist in movie history. The betrayal that almost destroyed him. The decision that cost him billions, but might have been the smartest move he ever made. And the heartbreaking reason why he spent $600,000 on therapy and couldn't sleep for 7 years. This isn't just the story of Star Wars. This is the story of a shy kid from California who accidentally created a cultural phenomenon, then spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to live with what he had done. Get ready for the most honest and emotional confession you've ever heard from one of Hollywood's biggest legends. George Lucas was born on May 14th, 1944, in a small town called Modesto, California. His father owned a tiny stationery store and ran a small walnut farm to make extra money. His mother was often sick and had to stay in hospitals for long periods of time, which left their house feeling quiet and empty most of the time. George grew up in a very strict religious household, where his parents believed that hard work and following rules were the most important things in life. His father expected George and his brothers and sisters to eventually take over the family, store, and continue running the small farm. But even as a little boy, George was different from what his parents wanted him to be. He was a dreamer who lived in his own imagination, always thinking about strange new worlds and exciting adventures that existed only in his mind. Everything changed for young George in July 1955 when his family visited Disneyland for the very first time. The park had just opened its gates to the public, and George was completely amazed by everything he saw. The magical rides, the fantasy worlds, the way stories came to life right in front of his eyes. It planted a seed in his imagination that would never stop growing. As a kid, George became completely obsessed with science fiction shows and movies. He couldn't get enough of old adventure serials like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, which played at local movie theaters every weekend. He would rush home from school every day to watch these shows on television, and he read comic books constantly. He spent hours drawing spaceships and strange alien creatures in his school notebooks instead of paying attention to his teachers. George also loved reading adventure books like Robinson Crusoe and Treasure Island, but Flash Gordon was his absolute favorite. He watched every single episode religiously, never missing a week. This obsession was much more than just a hobby or something to pass the time. George started creating entire stories in his head, building strange new worlds and sketching out ideas for characters and adventures. Many years later, when George wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie but couldn't get permission to use the characters, that childhood obsession would transform into something completely new and original, Star Wars. But growing up wasn't easy for the quiet, imaginative boy. At Thomas Downey High School in Modesto, George was small for his age, painfully shy, and preferred to keep to himself most of the time. He only grew to be about 5 feet 7 inches tall as an adult, and during his teenage years, he was an easy target for school bullies who picked on smaller, quieter kids. George felt invisible most of the time, preferring to escape into his books, model car kits, and old movie serials rather than deal with the social pressures of high school. He tried his best to avoid crowds and any kind of conflict or confrontation. But something interesting happened when George took a photography class. Behind a camera, he wasn't the shy, picked-on kid anymore. He became an observer, someone who could watch the world and capture it in ways that other people found interesting and beautiful. His teachers started to notice that George had a natural talent for composition and visual storytelling. Even though he still kept mostly to himself and didn't have many friends, these early struggles with feeling like an outsider shaped the way he would later think about creating characters for his movies. He started caring deeply about underdogs, misfits, and anyone who didn't quite fit into the normal world around them. George's grades in school were average at best, mostly C's and C minuses. He openly admitted later in life that he spent most of his classes daydreaming and didn't care much about traditional subjects like math, history, or English. But there were two things that George absolutely loved: cars and cameras. He would spend hours after school working on a small yellow Italian sports car called an Autobianchi Bianchina, which was based on the tiny Fiat 500. George was completely obsessed with modifying this little car and racing it around the streets and dirt tracks near Modesto. At the same time, he used his family's 8mm camera to film car races and other events around town, teaching himself the basics of movie making through trial and error. His parents thought both of these activities were just distractions that were keeping him from focusing on more important things like school and planning for a practical career. But they weren't just hobbies. They were actually the beginning of something much bigger and more important than anyone could have imagined. Everything in George Lucas's life changed completely on June 12, 1962, just 3 days before he was supposed to graduate from high school. George was driving home in his beloved modified Bianchina when disaster struck. A classmate named Frank Ferreira was speeding in a much larger Chevrolet Impala and tried to pass George's tiny car just as George was turning into his family's driveway. Massive Chevy slammed into George's small car with tremendous force. The Bianchina flipped over and over again before crashing violently into a walnut tree. The accident was so brutal and devastating that the next day, a photograph of George's completely mangled car appeared on the front page of the local newspaper. The Modesto B. Frank, who was driving the much larger and heavier car, walked away from the crash without a single scratch. But George's situation was completely different and much more serious. His seatbelt snapped during the impact, which might have actually saved his life because it threw him out of the car just moments before the entire vehicle crumpled like a piece of paper against the tree. When paramedics arrived at the scene, George wasn't breathing and had no heartbeat. They rushed him to the hospital, where he hovered between life and death for what seemed like an eternity. His lungs were completely crushed from the impact. Multiple ribs were broken. He was vomiting blood, and his skin had turned blue from lack of oxygen. For 2 terrifying weeks, George remained in the intensive care unit, barely hanging on to life. The doctors weren't sure he was going to survive, and they prepared his family for the worst possible outcome. But somehow, against all odds, George managed to pull through the most critical period. Later in life, George said that the car accident made him realize for the first time how incredibly thin the line between life and death really is. That crash completely changed his way of thinking about everything. He said, "I decided right then that I was going to make something meaningful out of my life. I wasn't going to waste the second chance I had been given." During the 4 long months that George spent recovering from his injuries, he couldn't do any of the physical activities he had always loved. He couldn't work on cars, he couldn't go racing, and he could barely move around without pain. So instead, he started reading like he had never read before in his entire life. George devoured books on mythology, philosophy, and anthropology, subjects he had completely ignored during his school years. He went from being a poor student who didn't care about learning to someone who was deeply curious about the world and how it worked. He reflected seriously on his life and what he wanted to do with his future. That time spent in bed recovering gave him a completely new sense of purpose and direction. George also began struggling with what psychologists call survivor's guilt. He kept wondering why he had lived through such a terrible accident when he could have easily died. That question would follow him for many years and eventually become part of the deeper themes in the stories he would tell. Ideas about purpose, destiny, and the quiet journey that turns an ordinary person into a hero. When George finally got better and was able to move around normally again, he enrolled in Modesto Junior College. For the first time in his life, he started studying subjects like psychology and philosophy, the same subjects he had once completely ignored and found boring. His grades improved dramatically because he was also finally interested in learning. That George took his very first film class and discovered that he had a natural talent for visual storytelling. Even though he was no longer racing cars because of his injuries, he still took photographs of car races, from the sidelines, pursuing his love of automobiles in a much safer way. Through this new and safer hobby of photographing racing events, George met a professional cinematographer named Haskell Wexler, who was also a racing enthusiast. Wexler immediately saw something special in George's work and his way of looking at the world through a camera lens. He strongly encouraged George to apply to USC's School of Cinematic Arts, one of the most prestigious film schools in the country. In 1965, George earned his associate degree from Modesto Junior College and transferred to USC to study filmmaking. It marked the end of his dreams of becoming a professional race car driver, but it was actually the beginning of everything else that would make him famous and successful. At USC, George threw himself into his studies with an intensity and dedication that amazed his professors and fellow students. He was so eager to learn everything he could about filmmaking that he managed to complete 2 full years of undergraduate courses in just 1 year. George was 21 years old when he officially joined the film program, and he quickly became close friends with other future filmmakers who would go on to become some of the most successful directors in Hollywood history. His circle of friends included Walter Murch, who would become a legendary film editor and sound designer, John Milius, who would write and direct films like Conan the Barbarian, and Caleb Deschanel, who would become one of Hollywood's most respected cinematographers. This group of ambitious young filmmakers was later nicknamed the Dirty Dozen because of their rebellious attitude toward traditional Hollywood filmmaking. 2 professors at USC had a particularly deep influence on George's development as a filmmaker. The first was Lester Novros, who taught his students about the importance of color, light, and movement in cinema rather than just focusing on traditional storytelling techniques. The second was Slavko Vorkapich, who taught George how editing and montage could be used to manipulate time and emotion in ways that could make audiences feel exactly what the filmmaker wanted them to feel. These lessons would later shape Lucas's signature cinematic style and approach to making movies. In 1967, George created a short film called Electronic Labyrinth THX 1138 4EB as his senior project. It was a 15-minute dystopian science fiction film about a man trying to escape from a society where the government watches and controls everything. What shocked everyone who saw the film was how incredibly advanced and professional it looked and sounded, especially considering it was made by a college student with a very limited budget. George had found a clever and creative way to get free access to expensive filmmaking resources that most students could never afford. He volunteered to teach a class that nobody else wanted to teach, a Navy training course at USC, which gave him unlimited access to expensive color film stock and professional laboratory processing equipment. The Navy men in his class became his cast and crew, and he filmed at real-world locations like Los Angeles International Airport and UCLA during nighttime hours when he could use the facilities for free. The final film was so impressive that it earned George the Samuel Warner Memorial Scholarship, one of the most prestigious awards given to film students, and a 6-month internship at Warner Brothers Studios. Years later, the Library of Congress decided that the film was so culturally and historically significant that they preserved it in the National Film Registry, an honor reserved for only the most important films in American cinema history. At USC, George didn't just work hard, he barely slept. He would spend 18 hours a day editing film, often experimenting late into the night with new techniques and ideas. He formed a small group called the Clean Cut Cinema Club with fellow students Don Glutt and Chris Lewis. Together, they created a small production company called Sunrise Productions, and George even used the pseudonym Lucas Beaumont for some of their projects. Their biggest and most ambitious project was a film that unfortunately never got finished, called 543. It was supposed to be a fake documentary about the making of a fake beach movie called Orgy Beach Party. The concept was strange, creative, and way ahead of its time in terms of mixing different styles of filmmaking. These were also the years when George first became close friends with Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese, relationships that would prove to be incredibly important throughout their careers. All three young filmmakers would go on to become some of the most successful and influential directors in movie history. Right after George graduated from college, something completely unexpected happened that could have changed the entire course of his life. He was drafted to serve in the Vietnam War. George was 23 years old, which was exactly the right age for military service. But during his required medical examination, doctors discovered that he had inherited type 2 diabetes from his grandfather. Combined with the lung injuries he had suffered from his car accident years earlier, the military doctors classified him as 4F, which meant he was medically unfit to serve in combat. That rejection from military service left a deep and lasting impression on George. It made him think very critically about war, government power, and authority figures in general. He became deeply skeptical of governments and the people who run them. George had once wanted to make a student film about a soldier fighting from inside an airplane, but that idea later evolved and developed into the movie Apocalypse Now through conversations he had with his mentor, Francis Ford Coppola. His brush with the Vietnam War, even though it was indirect, helped shape many of the rebellion and anti-authority themes that would later appear in both Star Wars and his earlier film THX 1138. The experience taught him to question power and to sympathize with people who fight against oppressive systems. But before Star Wars ever reached a movie theater screen, George Lucas nearly lost everything he had worked for. It all started with a film called THX 1138, which he made using just $777,000. A very small budget even by the standards of the early 1970s. The movie was strange, cold, and very artistic, but it was also difficult for most audiences to understand and enjoy. When THX 1138 was released in theaters, audiences largely stayed away. The film only made $2.4 million at the box office, which meant it was a significant financial failure. That failure was absolutely crushing for George, both emotionally and financially. He had to personally return his advance money to Warner Brothers Studios, and the financial pressure was so overwhelming that it nearly ended his directing career before it had really even started. George realized something painful but important. If he wanted to survive as a filmmaker, he couldn't just make movies for himself and other film school graduates. He had to think seriously about what regular audiences wanted to watch and enjoy. That failure was bitter, humiliating, and expensive, but it quietly became one of the most important reasons that Star Wars was ever created in the first place. Though the failure of THX 1138 taught George a brutal but necessary truth about Hollywood. Artistic vision alone isn't enough to succeed. If THX 1138 had been a commercial hit, George might have spent the rest of his career making obscure, difficult art films that only a small number of people would ever see or appreciate. But the pain of that failure changed his entire approach to filmmaking and forced him to think about reaching broader audiences. What made the situation even worse was the sense of betrayal George felt from Warner Brothers Studios. They didn't just withdraw their financial support, they humiliated him in ways that left permanent scars. Warner Brothers forced Francis Ford Coppola, George's mentor and supporter, to return his advance money as well. They canceled 6 additional films that George's company was planning to make. Most insulting of all, without any warning or permission, Warner Brothers took 5 minutes of footage out of THX 1138 without consulting George, even though he had contractual final cut rights that were supposed to protect him from exactly this kind of interference. George was so furious about the unauthorized changes to his film that he and his team actually stole a copy of the movie from Warner Brothers' lot to prevent them from making any additional unauthorized edits. George later said that there was no practical or artistic reason for Warner Brothers to remove those 5 minutes. They did it simply to show him who was really in control. He felt completely used and betrayed by the experience. That traumatic experience left emotional scars that shaped George's future obsession with maintaining complete control over his projects. He never forgot what it felt like to lose his artistic voice and have his work changed without his permission. From that point forward, George became determined to never again put himself in a position where other people could have power over his creative decisions. The financial damage from THX 1138 extended beyond just George's personal career. American E. Zoetrope, the company that George had helped Francis Ford Coppola build, became a financial disaster. By 1990, the company was buried under $28.8 million in debt, while having only $22.1 million in assets. Coppola alone owed $3 million to one company, while the production company owed another $16.2 million to other investors and $6.2 million to Orion Pictures. Even back in 1983, a sister studio connected to American Zoetrope had gone completely bankrupt. George had already backed away from the company by that point, watching the financial chaos from a safe distance. The experience with THX 1138 had taught him that he needed to protect himself financially and professionally, and he learned to be very careful about getting involved in projects that didn't have solid business plans. But then everything changed completely, with a movie that no one expected to be successful. American Graffiti was released in 1973 and became one of the most profitable films ever made relative to its budget. George made the movie for just $775,000, and it earned over $140 million worldwide. That represented nearly an 18,000% return on investment, which was almost unheard of in the movie business. Suddenly, the same person who had failed so dramatically with THX 1138 had created a massive hit that topped the summer box office. American Graffiti was so successful that it even outperformed major studio films with much larger budgets, like the James Bond movie Live and Let Die. George cast mostly unknown actors in American Graffiti, including a young Harrison Ford, who only had a small supporting role. The film earned George his first Academy Award nominations and, more importantly, gave him the financial freedom and industry credibility to try making the space adventure movie he had been dreaming about. The success of American Graffiti proved that George could make movies that audiences actually wanted to see, not just critics and film school professors. It demonstrated that he understood how to tell stories that connected with regular people and their emotions. Most importantly, it gave him the leverage he needed to convince a major studio to take a chance on his next project, a strange science fiction movie that he wanted to call Star Wars. In 1973, George Lucas began writing the first draft of what would eventually become Star Wars, but his initial version was absolutely terrible and embarrassing. He called this early draft Journal of the Whills, and it was so bad that it could have ended his career if anyone had discovered what he had done. The early script shamelessly stole dialogue and plot points from Edgar Rice Burroughs' 1931 science fiction novel, A Fighting Man of Mars. Even worse, George copied entire sections from Donald Ritchie's book about the famous Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. If anyone in Hollywood had found out about this plagiarism, it could have destroyed George's reputation and ended his filmmaking career before Star Wars was ever made. But instead of giving up when he realized how bad his first draft was, George made a decision that would change his life and the history of cinema. He decided to keep rewriting the script day after day for 3 solid years. Every single day for 8 hours, George worked on improving his story, slowly transforming what had started as stolen ideas into something completely original and unique. During this process, George discovered a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, which analyzed the common patterns and themes found in myths and legends from cultures all around the world. This book became George's guide for understanding how to tell stories that would resonate with people on a deep emotional level. Campbell's ideas about the hero's journey, the pattern of an ordinary person being called to adventure, facing challenges, and ultimately being transformed, became the foundation for Luke Skywalker's story in Star Wars. George didn't give up during those 3 years of constant rewriting. Instead, he gradually turned what had started as shameful plagiarism into one of the most beloved and influential myths of the modern world. The process taught him that even the worst failures could be transformed into success through persistence, hard work, and a willingness to keep improving. In 1975, George finally had a script that he was proud of, and he managed to convince 20th Century Fox to give him a contract to make Star Wars. But the studio executives didn't really believe in the project. They thought it was a weird science fiction movie that wouldn't appeal to mainstream audiences. They were so skeptical about the film's potential that they agreed to one of the most financially disastrous deals in movie history. George offered to reduce his salary as director from $500,000 to just $150,000 in exchange for keeping all the rights to any sequels and all merchandising rights, meaning he would own the rights to make toys, games, and other products based on the movie. The Fox executives thought this was a great deal for them because they believed that science fiction toys and merchandise were completely worthless. They laughed at George's request and quickly agreed to give him the sequel and merchandising rights in exchange for the lower salary. In their minds, they were getting a talented director to make their movie for less money, and they were giving him rights to things that had no value whatsoever. It was one of the worst business decisions in entertainment history. By 2014, the Star Wars franchise was worth approximately $37 billion. And the toys alone were generating about $5 billion in sales every single year. By 2016, when George was exploring the possibility of selling his toy rights to various companies, only the Kenner Toy Company was willing to make an offer. And even they only offered $100,000 upfront plus a 5% royalty on each toy sold. That single decision to trade a higher salary for sequel and merchandising rights eventually made George Lucas a billionaire. And he never forgot the lesson it taught him about the importance of maintaining control over his creative properties. Making Star Wars, however, wasn't the magical, smooth process that fans might imagine. It was actually a complete nightmare from beginning to end. Filming began in Tunisia on March 22, 1976, and almost immediately, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. On just the second day of filming, the Tunisian desert experienced its first winter rainstorm in 50 years. The unexpected weather brought production to a complete halt. Many of the crew members got severe food poisoning and dysentery from eating local food. Stuart Freeborn, the artist who designed many of the alien creatures, got pneumonia and had to be hospitalized in London, leaving the production without one of its key creative people. The robots that were supposed to be the stars of the movie constantly broke down. R2-D2's motors failed repeatedly, and C-3PO's costume was so poorly designed that it kept breaking and actually cut Anthony Daniels' foot during filming. Props that were supposed to work perfectly in key scenes simply didn't function when the cameras were rolling. When the production moved from Tunisia to Elstree Studios in London on April 7, 1976, things got even worse. The British film crew treated the entire project like a joke. They called it a kid's cartoon and openly mocked George and his vision. They refused to work past 5:30 in the evening unless they were paid expensive overtime wages, which the production couldn't afford. Kenny Baker, the actor inside the R2-D2 costume, later admitted that he was convinced the movie was going to be a complete flop and that he was embarrassed to be part of it. The entire cast and crew treated the film like it was destined to fail, and George felt completely alone and unsupported during the most stressful period of his life. The special effects were an even bigger disaster. George had created a company called Industrial Light and Magic specifically to create the visual effects for Star Wars because no existing company could do what he wanted. But when George visited ILM during post-production to check on their progress, he discovered that they had completed only 7 shots after months of work. And he said that only one of those 7 shots was actually usable in the final film. Sotheby und Special effects team had already spent over $1 million on a movie that had a total budget of just $11 million, and they had almost nothing to show for it. George was absolutely furious. The team was working at a relaxed, casual pace, while George was under enormous pressure to deliver a finished film to the studio. John Dykstra, the supervisor of the special effects team, couldn't control the situation or motivate his workers to meet their deadlines. George had to step in personally and take control of the effects work. He fired the film's editor and worked weekends and late nights to cut scenes himself. He did whatever it took to save the movie from becoming a complete disaster. The pressure of trying to save Star Wars nearly killed George Lucas. He was only 28 years old, but the stress was so overwhelming that his health began to break down completely. After a particularly difficult argument with John Dykstra about the special effects delays, George felt sharp pains in his chest and thought he was having a heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors determined that he was suffering from extreme stress and dangerous high blood pressure. The doctors told him that he needed to stop working so intensively, or he would risk serious damage to his health or even death. But George couldn't stop. He had to finish the movie or face financial ruin and the end of his career. On the film set, even Harrison Ford openly mocked the dialogue that George had written, telling him that the lines were impossible for actors to say convincingly. George was convinced that Star Wars was going to be a complete failure and that his career as a director was over. He was so exhausted and discouraged that he decided right then that he would never direct another Star Wars movie if the first one was successful. But George kept working just long enough to finish the film. When Star Wars was finally released, on May 25, 1977, it made over $775 million worldwide and changed the movie industry forever. It became the highest-grossing film in history up to that point, and turned George Lucas from a struggling filmmaker into one of the most successful people in Hollywood. When it came time to make the sequel, The Empire Strikes Back, George did something that shocked everyone in the industry. He decided that Darth Vader would be revealed as Luke Skywalker's father, but he kept this secret so carefully that only 2 people in the entire production knew the truth: George himself and Mark Hamill, the actor who played Luke. The script that everyone else read, including the actor inside the Darth Vader costume, contained completely different dialogue. David Prowse, who physically portrayed Vader, spoke fake lines that said, "Obi-Wan killed your father." Only James Earl Jones, who provided Vader's voice, recorded the real dialogue later in a sound studio. George kept the secret locked away so tightly that when the film was released on May 21, 1980, audiences around the world gasped in shock at the revelation. It became the greatest plot twist in movie history, and absolutely no one saw it coming because George had been so careful to protect the surprise. But behind the scenes, George was risking everything he had earned from the success of the first Star Wars movie. He paid for The Empire Strikes Back entirely with his own money, taking out an $18 million loan that would have financially ruined him if the film had failed. As production costs went up and stress mounted, George's relationship with producer Gary Kurtz, who had been his close collaborator for 10 years, began to crack under the pressure. Kurtz later said that everyone involved in the production was affected by the enormous pressure of trying to live up to the success of the original film. But George refused to give up control of the project to the studio, even though that would have eliminated his financial risk. The movie eventually made $538 million worldwide, so the risk paid off, and George was able to keep ownership of all the rights to the Star Wars franchise. But then, disaster struck the production in an unexpected way. Just before filming was scheduled to begin on Return of the Jedi, a fire completely destroyed Stage 3 at Elstree Studios in London. Fire trucks couldn't reach the scene quickly because the roads leading to the studio were blocked by construction, and everything on the stage burned to the ground. All of the elaborate sets that had been built for the film were lost, and filming had to be delayed by 3 months while they were rebuilt from scratch. Stanley Kubrick, who was filming The Shining at a nearby stage, used the fire as an excuse to claim more studio space for his own production, which made George and his Team Furious. Producer Gary Kurtz said that the fire was the single hardest challenge of making the movie. Rebuilding 64 different sets wasn't just expensive. It nearly broke the production company financially and emotionally. The stress of dealing with this disaster destroyed George's friendship with Kurtz, who had been his closest collaborator. For over a decade, Kurtz had produced American Graffiti and the first Star Wars movie, and he had been instrumental in George's early success. But by the time they were making The Empire Strikes Back, George had transformed Lucasfilm into a massive corporation with hundreds of employees. He started hiring outside executives and business people, and he became increasingly focused on the commercial aspects of the Star Wars franchise, especially the profitable toy sales. Kurtz hated this change in direction. He wanted the focus to remain on storytelling and character development, rather than on creating products that could be sold to children. George, on the other hand, blamed Kurtz for every delay and budget overrun during production. Their friendship deteriorated to the point where they stopped speaking to each other entirely. Whether Kurtz quit or was fired depends on who tells the story, but they never worked together again after Return of the Jedi. The end of this important friendship was just one of many personal costs that George paid for his success with Star Wars. With the enormous profits from the Star Wars movies, George decided to build himself a fortress where he could work in complete privacy and isolation. In 1978, he bought land in Marin County, California, that would eventually become Skywalker Ranch. The property covered 4,700 acres of rolling hills and forests, and George spent over $100 million creating what was essentially a private kingdom. Skywalker Ranch had its own fire station, a lake that George named after the Ewoks from Return of the Jedi, a private movie theater called The Stag, and even vineyards for making wine. But most of the land was left completely wild and undeveloped. The ranch was much more than just a movie studio. It was George's escape from the pressures and demands of Hollywood's success. The ranch was so private and exclusive that even President Ronald Reagan wasn't allowed to take a tour of it when he requested a visit. George wanted complete peace and solitude, and he felt that he had earned the right to privacy after years of dealing with the stress of making movies and managing a large company. During this period, George also teamed up with his friend Steven Spielberg to create the Indiana Jones franchise. Together, they made Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they were both committed to making everything in the movie look and feel as realistic as possible. On May 27, 1980, they met with the team at Industrial Light and Magic to plan the stunts and special effects for the film. George and Steven deliberately chose to use dangerous practical effects rather than safer alternatives because they believed it would make the movie more exciting and authentic. People got hurt during filming, but George and Spielberg didn't let safety concerns stop them from pursuing their vision. They believed that practical, physical effects would always look better than anything created artificially. The famous opening scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones escapes from a cave full of deadly traps, was incredibly difficult and dangerous to film, but it became one of the most iconic sequences in movie history. George and Steven were willing to accept risks and even injuries because they were committed to creating something that felt completely real and thrilling. In 1984, George Lucas released a film that would accidentally change Hollywood forever, but not in the way he had planned. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom shocked audiences with scenes that were considered too intense and frightening for the PG rating it had received. People watched in horror as a man's heart was ripped from his chest while he was still alive. Children were enslaved and whipped, and human sacrifices ended with people being burned alive. Parents were absolutely furious. They had brought their children to the theater, expecting another fun, family-friendly adventure like Raiders of the Lost Ark. But instead they witnessed what many considered to be nightmare fuel that was completely inappropriate for young viewers. George later admitted that both he and Steven Spielberg were going through very difficult periods in their personal lives during the making of this film. George was in the middle of a painful divorce, and Stephen had just ended a serious romantic relationship. Their emotional pain and anger leaked into the movie, making it much darker and more violent than either of them had originally intended. The public outcry about Temple of Doom was so loud and persistent that it forced the entire Hollywood system to create a new movie rating category. Just 2 months after the film's release in June 1984, the Motion Picture Association of America introduced the PG-13 rating, which was designed to warn parents that a movie might contain material that was inappropriate for younger children, but not quite mature enough for an R rating. The first movies to receive the new PG-13 rating were Red Dawn and The Woman in Red, but the entire system existed because of the controversy that George Lucas had accidentally created with Temple of Doom. His personal heartbreak had literally changed the way movies were classified and marketed to audiences. Just 1 year earlier, in 1983, George's personal life had completely collapsed in a very public and humiliating way. On June 16, 1983, the Modesto Bee newspaper reported that George and his wife Marcia were getting divorced after 14 years of marriage. This wasn't just the end of a personal relationship. It was the destruction of one of the most important creative partnerships. In movie history, Marcia Lucas wasn't just George's wife. She was also an Academy Award-winning film editor who had played a crucial role in shaping the success of Star Wars. She had edited the original film and helped give it the emotional power and pacing that made it so effective. Beyond her technical contributions, Marcia was the heart and social center of Lucasfilm, organizing parties and social events that held the creative team together, while George focused obsessively on work. When George and Marcia divorced, she received between $35 and $50 million in cash as part.